Now, the Biden administration has decided to make infrastructure renovation and renewal one of its primary focuses. On the one hand, they want to build infrastructure, not least to serve the interests of the poor and the working class.
Absolutely.
Right? Because the rich can't take infrastructure for themselves, let's say. But if the regulatory structure is such that these projects are actually not practically implementable, well, how does that influence your thinking about such things?
I think it's a really interesting point that people should be aware of. So you've heard the adage that time is money, right? Time is money. That is really true in infrastructure. If you delay a project by 5 or 7 years because of the NEPA process, right, then you just increase the costs enormously. I mean, it could double the cost or something of that nature. And so what's happening now, it's actually very interesting. I think you'll find this very interesting. During the Trump administration, there were folks in the White House who suggested a new model for NEPA, and it's called the one federal decision, right? One federal decision. And that is the idea that you would have a lead federal agency. So you wouldn't have the Environmental Protection Agency and you'd have some other, all these different agencies that have to weigh in for project approval. One agency would take the lead in shepherding the proposal, right, through the federal process. And that agency could actually, if the other agencies were dragging their feet, would have the power basically to make a decision for them. The situation now, Jordan, is one agency will hand the proposal off to another, and that'll hand it off to another and off to another. And as you can see, it slows down the process enormously. And I believe that in the bill that was signed by or voted on by the House late on Friday night, the one federal decision language is in the bill, right? But on the other hand, there's folks within the Biden administration who are trying to walk back some of the Trump era reforms with regard to expediting the environmental impact statement process, right? So I think we all want to protect the environment, but there has to be some limit on how much time can be spent, on these things before you either say yes or no, basically. So there's a bit of pulls, things are being pulled in two different directions, with the bill basically saying we're going to do one federal decision, and that's going to be a big reform of the NEPA process that policy people like me love. And then there's another pull within the administration to kind of repeal some of the Trump era reforms on this. So one of the big things we would like to see is it hasn't really been reformed since 1970, which is a long time ago. And there's, as you know, Jordan, an ecosystem of lawyers and consultants, et cetera, in Washington that have built up around the NEPA process, and they that whole thing slows it down. So that would be one sort of major reform that we think would expedite infrastructure delivery in the United States, speed it up and essentially do it at lower cost. And so, we're hopeful that that's when the president signs the bill, that'll be, part of it, and we'll see some changes. But in answer to your original question, Jordan, things I think are so cumbersome at this stage that you could never build the interstate highway system in the United States today the way you did in the 50s and 60s.
There's very little discussion in the media, in conversations around this topic with any sophistication. Like even something like infrastructure to me has been pushed into such sort of gridlock that any discussion of regulation from the left is viewed as, corporations trying to roll back stuff so they can dump toxins into oceans and make more profit, rather than that being able to be framed and described as you're doing it. Everybody has an intuitive sense of that. Anyone who's ever done a remodel or had a home project, everyone knows the cost and the expense of anything that takes longer and how onerous that is and how many different layers. And, part of what from the messaging perspective is how do we, yet again, it's another example about how the working class, small businesses and the poor are being held hostage by a messaging apparatus from both sides that has sort of distilled the argument into sort of tribal warfare on either side. It seems like we can get very little sane discussion in mainstream media about the role, for instance, that regulation plays and how to strike the balance. And you're so clear about it. Of course, we need to, protect the environment. Of course, we care about species in extinction and disruptions to the habitat, but we also can't take 6 years to build an overpass in New York City. It's just not going to be functional.
Retain an economy that simultaneously serves the needs of the people who are least well off, because they're the ones who will pay the price for those delays fundamentally. Absolutely.
Another way of saying that, Jordan, is all these delays and cost. It's like a regressive tax, right? In other words, it's a tax. Economists would think about it as an implicit tax that disproportionately hurts the poor.
Why disproportionately hurts the poor?
Well, I mean, these facilities, let's go back and talk about the actual facilities, the actual infrastructure, right, that we're talking about. As I stress, it provides basic public goods and services. So mobility, getting to school, getting to your work, getting to your community activities, right? The history of infrastructure is, and this goes 200 years back in the U.S. Postal Service, is the history of trying to provide all communities with access, right? Or being sure that no communities are left out. That goes back to the horse post, right? When you were delivering letters and cards and newspapers by horse. And the goal in the United States was that all communities should have access to a post office, right? And the history of infrastructure in the United States, universal landline telephones. There was a farms to markets movement where we tried to pave rural roads because farmers couldn't get their harvest to the market, in time on dirt roads that were full of mud. So there was this farms to markets. There was electrification during the Roosevelt year, rural electrification. It's always been across sectors, this goal of everybody having access. And that's fundamentally what the infrastructure is about.
The most important thing that might be done to rectify absolute poverty and maybe to mitigate relative poverty would be the provision of energy as cheaply as possible. And the second most important would be the universal provision of efficient infrastructure. Is that are those propositions reasonable from the perspective of an economist?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely crucial. But I would say that the energy infrastructure, the energy is part of the infrastructure, the generating, distribution, and transmission capacity you need to get power, right, to people. That's a crucial. We kind of think, the extension of that is we don't like to live in a society where some communities are systematically don't have these things, right? We kind of think everybody should have heat, everybody should have electric, everybody should have mobility, right, in your community. So I would say absolutely. And that's why having these things, there's this big notion of equity, right? Which is kind of this amorphous term, and some of us are bothered by the lack of definition. But in infrastructure, it is used generally. I think it's this old notion of universal service, universal access, where it's equitable for all communities to have this. And of course, consider myself to be an old-time regulatory economist, and I'm always harping on how these issues have been studied for a century or longer in these, to provide these basic services as the technology evolves. And now, of course, with this Zoom call, we know how important broadband internet access is, and kids need to have it for school and people need to have it for work. And so we don't want either urban pockets to be left without it, or rural.